As you probably can see, I'm not actually Professor Snyder. My husband's in Europe again, and you've probably by now figured out how things work in our family. He disappears, and I show up and talk about something vaguely similar to what he would talk about, but probably in a different way, because we're not actually coordinated enough to, give the same lecture. All right, I feel like you guys are very spread out in this extremely large space. So I looked yesterday at the syllabus to see what you guys are reading, and you were reading that chapter of the book that Tim did with Tony Judt. So I'm going to start off by talking to you about that and about Tony. But maybe I will first tell you a cheerful anecdote, which those people who were in my class yesterday already heard. So our 15-year-old son, our kids are native German speakers, not obviously because of the parents. Tim and I both have terrible accents in German. His is better than mine is. But we spent a lot of time in Vienna. We have a long-lasting connection to a research institute there, which is a whole other story. It's a very interesting story of this research institute. But our kids have done a couple years of school in Austria and are native German speakers. And Caleb, our 15-year-old son, was studying in his history class the post-World War I labor movement in Canada and the Winnipeg General Strike. And so I was excited about learning some Canadian history with him, so we were going over. Oh, you can't hear me?
Maybe the mic a little bit more directly in front of your mouth.
Okay, let's see, because it feels very loud and echoey to me. I'm wondering if maybe people should move closer, because I think if I turn it up, I'm going to get too much.
That's already better with the microphone over.
How is this? Is this better? Okay. All right. I'm not very good with microphones. So Winnipeg General Strike, about which I know nothing, but now I'm learning some things. So we were talking about the labor union, and we were talking about exploitative conditions for workers, and we were talking about Marxism. And then when we were on the subway going to school, I said, oh, I have an idea. I was telling him about the Hegelian word Aufhebung. I'll spare you my whole Hegel thing. But it's a very important word both for Marx and Hegel, and the kids are in a good position to understand it because they're German speakers. It doesn't translate that well into English. I said, listen, I have an idea. When I get to my office, I'll print out the Communist Manifesto in German, and then we can read it together tonight in German. And then when he came to meet me after school, he said, you know, Mom, don't take this the wrong way, but I'm going to print out the Communist Manifesto in German and we'll read it together tonight. That's not really the kind of thing you say on a crowded subway, with lots of other people around. I was like, oh, I didn't think of that. So anyway, yes, you see the situation our poor children are in. Okay, but let me talk to you about, let me start out by talking to you about Tony Judt, who you hopefully read for today or will read soon, who very sadly and tragically didn't get to meet either of our children and died shortly after our son's birth. The book that you're reading, did Tim already talk to you about this book? A bit about this book?
No, we were supposed to read it, now we get to hear it.
Oh, okay, but he didn't tell you the story of how the book came into existence. He needs to tell more stories, especially since you guys have this long lecture period. You've got the luxurious amount of time to tell stories. So Tony Judt was one of the great historians of the generation of 1968. He was born in 1948. and came from a Jewish family in London, East European immigrant Jewish family. And ended up most famously as a professor at New York University, where he ran the Remark Institute, which was a kind of really remarkable place for both European studies and a kind of intellectual salon. You know, he ran the best seminars in New York. He also just had this incredibly sharp mind, this very British sarcasm, you know, and an ability to speak improvisationally in full paragraphs. Things just came out of his mouth, kind of exquisitely formed. He was, let's see, there are so many stories I can tell you about Tony. He was diagnosed with ALS in his late 50s, around 2008, and deteriorated very, very quickly. Kind of into a state of paralysis. So he couldn't, first couldn't use his arms and then couldn't use his legs and then was in a wheelchair. The last public lecture he gave, and we have to dig up the video of this because it does exist somewhere, he gave with an oxygen tank, in a wheelchair, like on the stage without any notes in New York on what is living and what is dead in social democracy. And it was an extraordinary talk. It was before people were used to plastering everything on the internet, but it's got to be in the archive somewhere, and I will try to find it. But when Tony was kind of unable to do anything else, Tim had this idea that they should start to do conversations and record them, which could then be turned into a book. And Tony was working on 2 books at the time. One was a big intellectual history of modern Europe, and one was about trains. He was very interested in trains. And Tim and I were living in New Haven at the time. We didn't yet have children, so we had more freedom. And he started taking the train down from New Haven to New York every week to record these conversations with Tony. And they talked through the whole history of the 20th century. And again, Tony was one of these people who just had an extraordinary library in his head, because he couldn't move anymore. But his mind was just as sharp as it ever was. And I mean, if you listen to those tapes, you would never know anything was wrong, because the conversation is so sharp. And so they had very large numbers then. I mean, they must have had 100 hours of tapes, of recordings of these conversations. And then a graduate student of ours, Yedida Kamfer, with great love and exquisite care, transcribed all of them. And then she and Tim were working on the editing and put it together, and Tony approved the final version, and he died a few days later. So it was, it's a book I feel very attached to. It's a book Tim feels very attached to. It's kind of the last testament of really one of the great minds of the 20th century. It's also a bit sad. So we lost him. If you're interested, I can, now, see, I have time, so I'm going to tell you a couple more stories about Tony. So he died in 2010, in August, I think it was 2010. And then the revolution came in Ukraine in 2013, 2014. And our friend Yaroslav Hrytsak, the historian in Ukraine, said this should have been Tony's revolution. This would have been his revolution. He should have been here. And after the Maidan, in which one of Slavko's star graduate students was killed, was shot to death in the sniper massacre that climaxed that revolution, he put together a graduate seminar reading Tony Judt, and had his graduate students in Ukraine right after the Maidan and right as the war in the Donbass was beginning in the early months, read through all of Tony's work. And they were in Lviv at the time, and I was at Yale, and Yaroslav asked me if I could Skype in. This was pre-Zoom, we were on Skype, back in the Stone Age of just Skype. Asked me if I could Skype in and talk to his students about Tony's relationship to Marxism and Tony's relationship to Zionism, which I'll tell you about in a moment. And, and so I said, sure, and I'm sitting in my office at Yale, and I Skype in, and Yaroslav is there in a graduate classroom at the Ukrainian Catholic University with his graduate students, and they have their text in front of them. And then at a certain point, he puts me on hold because someone else is Skyping in, and it's a graduate student of his named Mykola, who was the best friend of the student who was killed on the Maidan. And in a state of extreme responsibility, and survivor guilt. Mykola had joined the Ukrainian army, was sent to the front in the Donbass, and then quickly, because he's fantastically smart and was doing a PhD in history, recruited into military intelligence. So he's now in an undisclosed location, in a bunker, with Tony's books marked up with all these margin notes. And he Skypes in because he wants to talk about Tony's relationship to Marxism in his military uniform, in this undisclosed location, in this Soviet-era bunker. And so Slavko comes back on, and the screen is split, and there's his classroom in Lviv, and there's Mykola in this bunker. And I just started crying. I thought this would have meant everything to Tony. If Tony could have seen these young people who were living through revolution and war, reading him so carefully, it would have meant everything to him. And so that was how I got to know this group of graduate students, and then you guys can look this up if you're interested. I then wrote a piece for The New Yorker called Reading Tony Judt in Wartime Ukraine, where I write about these students and what they're getting from his work at this particular moment, none of whom had a chance to beat him, kind of tragically. So let me tell you then a little bit about Tony's biography and how he kind of gets involved, in Eastern Europe in general. So he grew up in this family that came from the Bund. Did you guys learn, did Tim tell you anything about the Bund? So the Bund was this, he did, okay. Oh, no, you just know about the Bund, okay. No, but, so the Bund was a mass Jewish socialist workers movement, kind of growing up, alongside Leninism and the Russian Social Democratic Party, also founded in 1897. Anti-Zionist with a vision of a Marxist vision and a socialist vision and a Jewish autonomy vision that was going to be a mass Jewish workers movement alongside these other workers movements, that they would then be allied to. And so he comes from this family in which there's Marxism in the air. And he comes from a background that is steeped in Marxism, and he's later going to write an incredibly harsh, even kind of vicious attack on Sartre and Merleau-Ponty and the fellow traveling French intellectuals who are Stalinist apologists after the war. And it's an enormously controversial book. It's called Past Imperfect. And I asked him once, I said, after I read this book about Sartre, this incredibly harsh attack on Sartre, I said, were you ever a Marxist? And he said, I was a Zionist. I was a Zionist at one point, that I chose it very deliberately and then rejected it very explicitly. He said, Marxism was different. Marxism was just like the air I breathed when I was growing up. It wasn't something I chose and rejected. It was part of the thinking in my world. And you see towards the end of his life, and you see in this chapter that he continues to think in some sense with Marx and with these Marxist thinkers. His relationship to Zionism is also extremely interesting. He chooses Zionism very explicitly as a very young person, as a teenager, as 18, 19, and he goes to Israel to fight in the 1967 war. I think he's actually translating between Hebrew and French. He then drives tanks in the Golan Heights, and he is then bitterly disillusioned, at what he finds to be Jewish racism against the Arabs, that this was not what I thought it was going to be. And he will later cause enormous controversy, in New York especially, for his anti-Zionist writings. And it's the kind of anti-Zionism that is like the anti-communism of an author Kessler. You only have that kind of passion from having once been a believer on the inside. And he kind of wears his heart on his sleeve that way. His relationship to Marxism, and everything he's writing in this book, Thinking the 20th Century, has to do with processing these grand narratives, these big ideologies, of how we understand the world and where we're going. And his experiences from having been on the inside of them, from having been a believer, very much inflect everything. And what he was, after 1967, he leaves Israel, he gets very disillusioned, he comes back, he's studying in Oxford, then he's studying in Paris, and he takes part in 1968. He takes part in the student revolutions of 1968, and he is one of the students in Paris in May 1968 who is jumping up and down and chanting Ho Chi Minh, the communist leader during the Vietnam War. And I ask him, well, what then happened? And what then happens is very interesting from an intellectual history point of view because it's very biographical. He's teaching at Emory University in the early 1980s, I think it is, and he meets Jan Gross and Irena Grudzinska-Gross, who are exactly his generation. Both of them, come from Poland. They've both been cast into emigration by the so-called anti-Zionist campaign of 1968. They both sat in prison in 1968 for their role in student protest against communist censorship. And in fact, they come from a circle of young Polish intellectuals, many, if not most of whom, were sent to communist prison. In fact, many, if not most of whom, were the children of Polish Stalinists, who then, in a great Oedipal rebellion, would rise up to dismantle the system that their parents had built. It's a very interesting story, which I would love to tell you more about, but I probably should slightly move on to the generation of 68, because I'm going to go back to the 1920s in a moment. But that encounter, which is very contingent. History is all full of these kind of contingent moments. Like if Marx doesn't meet Engels in the Café de la Régence in Paris, if Alexander Koyré doesn't introduce Roman Jakobson to Claude Lévi-Strauss, in New York in the 1940s, we don't get structural anthropology. If Tony Judt doesn't meet Jan Gross and Irena Grudzinska, many things would have been different. But coming into contact with his peers, who were also in some ways veterans of the revolutionary moments of 68, but on the other side of the Iron Curtain, he starts feeling like we betrayed our East European counterparts. We who were on the left, we who were excited about the promises of Marxism, didn't understand the people who were suffering under Marxism. That when he realizes that precisely at that moment, when he was 20 years old, jumping up and down in the streets of Paris, chanting Ho Chi Minh, all of his new friends were sitting in communist prison. And that changes him. And all of his mature reflections of Marxism come from then that encounter. Then he learns Czech, then he starts going to Eastern Europe, then he starts looking at Marxism as it played itself out in practice. Okay, I'll tell you one more anecdote about Tony. I realize this is a very long introduction to the reading you did for today. But see, now you're going to feel like you know him better. Now hopefully you'll want to read the whole book. I'm very emotional about that book, but it's an extraordinary book. So back, I had a conversation with Tony. This was before I knew Tim. Tim and I each knew Tony before we knew each other. He was a kind of mentor figure in various ways for our generation of young historians. He took in kind of students, even if they weren't explicitly his students. So neither one of us ever studied explicitly at the same university with him, but he was a kind of mentor to both of us. And after I finished my dissertation, I was going off to my first job to teach at Indiana University, and I asked Tony for advice. Students in my class have heard this. He said, well, Marci, when I started teaching, back in the late 60s and early 70s, all of the students wanted to know one thing. They all wanted to know how how a set of ideas, how a philosophy, how something like Marxism that was so beautiful and so brilliant could have gone so wrong. He said, you're going to have a completely different challenge. You're going to come into a classroom and start to teach them Marxism. And they're going to want to know how anyone could have been so stupid as to buy into such a ridiculous set of ideas in the first place. And the first thing you have to do is get your students to make that imaginative leap and see what was so extraordinarily compelling to so many people across so much of the globe for such a long time. Because until they understand what was so magical, what was so seductive, nothing else that happens in the 20th century will make any sense. And he was right about that. So I realize with this very long introduction, I want to tell you a bit about the experience of Marxism in the 20th century, but the leap to make is why that had such a pull, why it grabbed people, why it captivated people. It cannot be, like, it's easy to say now, okay, this was ridiculous, this didn't work, this turned into terror. Retrospect is always very clear. But it wasn't just like a handful of nuts. I mean, there was something in it that captured, the best minds, across huge swaths of the globe, that captured people of all different social classes, from all different backgrounds, for all different reasons. And I want to try to give you a sense of that, not to justify what happened, because just extraordinarily gruesome, horrifying things happened, but to try to understand how it could have happened, because there is very little else that penetrated so deeply. And you see at the end of that chapter, where Tony starts talking about Nazism, he's just like, intellectually it was less interesting. We don't, in the intellectual history of Nazism is just not as interesting as the intellectual history of Stalinism. There just wasn't as much there. And there's something that keeps sending us back. And I'll throw out a couple of these things and then I'll try to develop them. I mean, one was just, on a basic level, the sheer fact of exploitation and suffering. And to really commune with the beginnings of Marxism and the suffering of the workers, you need to actually read something like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle or watch Andre Vida's The Promised Land. You need to really get into late 19th, early 20th century factory workers in completely gruesome conditions. Pre-labor legislation, and people are working 12, 14-hour workdays with appalling sanitation in dangerous conditions and no safety measures for subhuman wages. You have to, just the sheer extent of that kind of exploitation and the way in which that made sense to people. Because how do you look at that and say, okay, all of these thousands and thousands of people whose lives are hell, and even after spending 14 hours a day in these horrific conditions can't feed their families, and then there's a handful of people who own the factories who are getting rich. How do you justify that morally? Yeah. I mean, how do you see that as a way forward to the world? So there was a very strong moral impulse, that makes sense. It especially makes sense if you're looking into that factory. So Marx's ideas on alienation. If you were, a farmer, or, we would call them peasants, in Europe, or a shoemaker, you were connected to the product of your labor. You were starting to create something from the beginning of tilling the land and planting the seeds and growing the crops to harvesting the crops. There was a sense of you were creating something. And for Hegel, too, this creation is very important in labor. It's important for Arendt, too, but I'm going to bracket that. She makes a distinction between labor and work. If you were a shoemaker, you're starting with these raw materials and you're creating something. You're creating a pair of trousers. Here suddenly you have, with the advent of industrial capitalism, you have peasants moving into cities, becoming factory workers, doing things on the assembly line where they're just doing some little piece of some process. They're now alienated from the products of their labor. They have no ownership. It's not their kind of, they're not creating anything. They're just performing one repetitive task. And moreover, they're selling themselves in a cash economy by the hour. So they're turning themselves, their employers are turning them into commodities. So you don't need to be an intellectual to look at the condition of the workers and say that these people are suffering horribly and they're working very hard and getting nothing for it. And if you are an intellectual, you can start thinking about the ways in which turning a person into a thing and the reification of people, the commodification of people, is a kind of philosophical atrocity as well. So this can appeal to all sorts of people on all different levels. There are going to be ways in which it appeals as a philosophy of the overcoming of racism. You overcome the division that is nationhood, that is ethnicity, that is race, because workers of the whole world are supposed to unite. And eventually national borders are going to wither away. So it is also this anti-racist promise. I mean, if you look at the history of Marxism in the United States, and look at some of the black intellectuals, who become fellow travelers in the Soviet Union, and if you look at that against the background of American racism, of lynchings in the South, of Jim Crow laws, it makes a lot of sense. There's a Soviet propaganda movie called Circus, based on this anti-racism fantasy, which is actually, it's an old movie, but it's a great movie. If you want to commune with that, how the Soviet Union mobilized in its propaganda anti-racism, precisely because the capitalist world was so steeped in racism. And it obviously, the propaganda coming out of the Stalinist Soviet Union involved a lot of lies, but the fact that racism in the capitalist world was not a lie. That was very true. There really were Jim Crow laws, and there really were lynchings, and all of that was true. There are good reasons why you would want to look for a worldview that promised you the overcoming of that kind of racism. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to take you back to, I think Tim left you off. Has Lenin died yet? Did he kill off Lenin, or are we not quite there? Okay, I'll take you briefly back to the Bolshevik Revolution then. The Bolshevik Revolution is, it's happening in the midst of the First World War. So the sheer amount of death and chaos, there had never been a European war on that scale before, which is millions and millions of people, including civilians. Previously, war had been something that happened mainly between armies. World War I is the first total war in Europe. And the Bolshevik Revolution comes in the midst of this, as the Russian Empire is still fighting this war. And it's like this great conflagration. It's like a great fire. Nobody knows what it is. Lenin describes having found power lying in the streets and picks it up. At a moment of chaos, of anarchy, of radical uncertainty, he is decisive. He acts with audacity. He acts with chutzpah. He goes for it, even though the Bolsheviks are basically a tiny minority. And then there's this famous Trotsky quote where the Mensheviks cross over, not all of them, but some of them, and most famously Trotsky, when they see that the revolution is going forward, that history can be rushed. And Trotsky gave this famous speech in 1917 to his fellow Mensheviks and the liberals and says, "You are pitiful, isolated individuals. You are bankrupt. Your role is played out. Go where you belong from now on, into the dustbin of history." So this idea of the dustbin of history, we are moving forward. We are forging ahead, and everyone not coming along, is to be thrown out. Lenin at this time is banking on worldwide revolution, and that's very hard to imagine now. My older colleague, Alex Rabinovich, who taught the Russian Revolution for decades at Indiana University before he retired, and that was his specialty. He said Lenin's wager on international revolution was the single biggest mistake of the 20th century. I mean, Lenin really believes that, when he makes that separate peace with the Germans at Brest-Litovsk, I'm sure Tim told you about that, he likes that story. He really thinks that it doesn't matter in some sense, because an hour from now, tomorrow, next week, next month, at the farthest away, there's going to be a worldwide workers' revolution, and none of these agreements with any bourgeois power is going to make any sense. And that doesn't happen, although there were reasons that were not crazy for Lenin to think it might happen. I mean, they got close in Slovakia. There was a Hungarian revolution that lasted several months, and they were very close in Germany. I mean, how close, I can't really judge, but if the anti-communist hadn't gotten Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht and managed to murder them and throw their bodies in the river in Berlin, it might have gone forward in Germany. And it was a workers' movement of non-trivial strength. And Rosa Luxemburg remains a very romantic character. People still like going back to Rosa Luxemburg in her debates with Lenin and her conversations with Lenin. But had Rosa Luxemburg not been murdered, things would have played out differently. This is one of the things historians like to obsess about, these moments of contingency, where if something had gone a little bit differently, outcomes would have been radically different. And my son is trying to teach me calculus because I've forgotten math, and he really likes math. And so in history, in that sense, it's a nonlinear equation, right? There's like a butterfly effect, like a small change in input can lead to a big change in output. So somebody is like walking down a different street on a certain day, and you can have a whole other world. Okay, so the wager on international revolution doesn't happen. Lenin seizes the revolutionary moment. He's rushing history. You go into the Bolshevik Civil War, which is not even really one war. It's there are so many different wars going. I mean, 1919, Kiev alone was occupied, I think, 5 different times by 5 different armies. I mean, it's completely insane. I mean, you have Polish forces, you have different kinds of Ukrainian forces with different visions of an independent Ukrainian state. You have whites, you have reds, you have socialist revolutionaries who are radical leftists, but more with the peasantry, and there are people switching sides, and it's just this kind of bloodbath. And there's a level of violence, of millions and millions of people being killed. And the Leninist, the death toll of the Bolshevik Civil War is probably estimated 7 to 12 million, probably around 10 million deaths, mostly civilian. And this is after the First World War has just brought 15 to 22 million deaths. And so just unheard of numbers of people being slaughtered. And the Leninist slogan, that I'm sure you've heard is, you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. It's going to be a means-ends argument. You're going to use the future to justify the present. And that vision of temporality of time is very crucial to understanding Marxism in general. This notion of time moving forward. And what you get is a sense of the present no longer has all the fullness of the present, because it's just a kind of step on the way to the future. And so there's a certain kind of devaluing of it that can come about, because the important thing is the future. And sacrifices in the present can be justified in the name of this future. If you remember did we talk about the Brothers Karamazov last time? Everyone needs to read the Brothers Karamazov. It's one of my first Russian teachers told me, she said, in Russian, we have a saying, there are only 2 kinds of people in the world, those who have read the Brothers Karamazov and those who have not. But there's a famous moment in the Brothers Karamazov where the older brother Ivan is speaking to a younger brother Alyosha, and Alyosha is a kind of deeply good, kind Christian mystic believer type, and Ivan is struggling with the existence or non-existence of God. And he he offers to Alyosha this provocation. He said, if all the happiness of the world could be guaranteed for time, eternity, with the small cost of the torture to death of a small child, would you agree? Would you agree on that condition? You know, and Alyosha ends up saying, no, I can't agree. But this provocation, like when do the ends justify the means, is very central. And the Leninist slogan is, you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. So as you read through this literature, you'll get a lot of references to omelets. And people like Vladimir Tismaniano is saying, you know, we've got mountains of eggshells and no one's ever tasted the omelet. Okay, so there's one more little step. Tim probably mentioned this. 1921, the banning of factions, democratic centralism. Let me just throw this out because you should just, you know, bookmark it. So there's a moment in the history of the Bolshevik Party that is a kind of turn towards what we're going to call democratic centralism, in which Lenin bans factions. And what that means is that you can have discussions within the party about what should the next strategy be, what should the next move be. Like, there can be a conversation, there can be a debate, but once the party makes a decision, everyone gets in line. There are no more factions. You don't get to like join one group within the party or another group within the party that's supporting one policy or another party. Once the party makes the decision, like debate time is over, then you all get behind it. And this is what we now call democratic centralism. So this isn't central to today's lecture, but it's something you should just know and kind of bookmark. When people talk about democratic centralism, it goes back to Lenin and the 1921 decision to ban factions. December 30th, 1922, you get the creation of the Soviet Union. 1924, Lenin dies of a stroke prematurely, somewhat unexpectedly. And it again is another one of these moments of historical contingency. Whole books have been written on the premise of if Lenin had lived, because Lenin was playing such a singular role, and there was no clear successor. So the if Lenin had lived thing kind of continues to haunt us. Because Lenin dies in 1924, and then it's not clear what's going to happen because he's exerted such an extraordinary influence. I mean, I think this past November was the 30th anniversary of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in Israel. You know, and I often think kind of obsessively, like, you know, like there was about to be a Palestinian state. There was about to be a peace agreement. Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat had come to an understanding. He had a consensus behind him. If those bullets had missed, we would be in a different world now. We never get back to that moment. You know, so these sometimes it happens that something that happens to one person that is contingent, that might have happened differently, that might have not happened, is going to have ripple effects, you know, in a very big way. And this is the case with Lenin's death. He dies prematurely, unexpectedly. There's a power struggle, in particular between Trotsky and Stalin. Now, it's not even just, you know, two people with different personalities, both of whom want to be in charge. There are also actually like theoretical differences about Marxism. There's also going to be a big literature on the if Lenin had lived, and then the if Trotsky had won. So these are the two, like, road not taken. Like, you know, did it have to go to Stalinism? And there will be huge debates among philosophers and historians of Marxism about whether or not the Bolshevik Revolution had to take the path it did. The short version of the story is that, you know, Trotsky believed in permanent revolution, in that, like, you've got to keep going till you get the worldwide revolution. Stalin is going to look around and say, okay, worldwide revolution not happening, let's like hedge our bets, let's like firm up socialism in one country. Trotsky is also going to revolt against a bureaucracy that Stalin starts. But in any case, and people also think like Trotsky was like a very nice, kind guy, and, you know, Stalin was a monster. Stalin was a monster. You know, Trotsky was not opposed to terror. I mean, I think he was a much better person, but when we talk about comparing to Stalin, our bar is low. But in any case, Stalin wins the power struggle. He's going to, Trotsky's going to have to go off first to internal exile, then to external exile, and finally, Stalin's henchman is going to get Trotsky in Mexico with an ice pick in 1940, but not before he manages to have, a very exciting affair with the Mexican artist Frida Kahlo, which you can all see in the movie Frida, if you're interested in, it's another kind of legendary encounter. Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo, and Trotsky in Mexico, and then Trotsky gets killed by the ice pick because Stalin has his men chase Trotsky all around the world. But anyway, okay, I'll stop talking about Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo and various people's affairs, but you can all see the Frida movie. It's very good music in it as well. Stalin wins. Stalin wins, and he's going to consolidate power, and that's going to take some time. So 1924, we're into NEP. Did you guys get into NEP, to New Economic Policy? Okay, so what happens is that you're coming out of this war. Everything's been kind of, burnt to the ground. There's mass poverty, hunger, death, destruction, chaos, homelessness, like everything you can imagine. And how are we now going to build socialism? We don't even have a working class. You have a revolution that was carried out, a workers' revolution that was carried out not by workers, but on behalf of workers, and really not even on behalf of actual workers, because there aren't so many in the Russian Empire at the time, but on behalf of metaphysical workers who are yet to come into being, because we haven't actually transitioned from a peasant economy to a capitalist economy yet. So it's kind of carried on the basis of a metaphysical proletariat. So how are you going to institute communism in this situation? Well, Lenin's like, okay, we're going to have to make some compromises, until we can kind of catch our breath. And that's NEP, New Economic Policy, which is essentially a kind of compromise with the bourgeoisie. We can't actually purge all the bourgeois experts and technocrats and and engineers and factory owners, and because we don't really otherwise have an economy, and who's going to know how to do anything, and nobody has any money, and somehow we've got to jumpstart the economy. So the thing about the NEP years, and I'm not an economic expert at all, is there is this uneasy ideological feeling of kind of cohabitating with the bourgeoisie. And there are all sorts of interesting books about it, lists metaphor of kind of sleeping with the bourgeoisie, you're making this compromise until you can kind of catch your breath. So this accommodation with the bourgeoisie, because the government still needs bourgeois specialists. And they're trying at the time also to promote people from the proletariat. And this is where you get this Russian term that's not really translatable, vidvigency, who are the proletarian workers who they're managing to promote into these administrative managerial positions. Because you've got to, you're going from a feudal peasant economy, and now you've got to create a kind of urban class structure. And one of the things about these vidvigency, Sheila Fitzpatrick has interesting work on this, is that there was an upwardly mobile class of people then who were benefiting from this system. I mean, there was an authentic interest in raising up the workers and in promoting people from the proletariat. So there was a social class that was not just being crushed, but was benefiting from upward mobility in this period, that workers promoted into management. So it's a moment, too, where kind of as you move through the 20s, you're seeing a kind of dramatic upward mobility, and especially into the 1930s then, when you get more and more proletarians who are kind of promoted into these positions through the education they get the first 5-year plan. So one way to think about the NEP years, which is going to last more or less to 1928, 1929, is as utopia postponed. I think this is Eric Nyman's phrase, if I'm remembering correctly. Utopia postponed, we've won the revolution, but we can't just institute, complete communism tomorrow because we don't have the conditions. So utopia is being postponed, and we're making these compromises. Cohabitation with the bourgeoisie is the metaphor. 1928, that basically comes to an end with Stalin has consolidated his power. It really takes those 4 messy years. And that is the first 5-year plan. And the first 5-year plan is significant. And once you have the word 5-year plan in your mind, you won't be able to get it out of your mind. You'll just start thinking of the world in terms of 5-year plans. And then there's also this, can you rush history that Lenin, has started? Like, can we fulfill the 5-year plan in 4 years? And there's a slogan about catching up and overtaking the West. So this Leninist idea of acceleration, that history can be rushed, that it can be nudged, it stays. It keeps going. This feeling that you've got to forge ahead with the 5-year plan. So they're gonna try to do this very fast. And they've got to get industrialization going, before people are like, wait, how did we carry out a workers' revolution without our workers were our workers? And so you get various phenomenon, one of which I want to throw out here is the Stakhanovite phenomenon. And Stakhanovite, I put these on your handout, so if you're not catching the words now, Lee uploaded it into Quercus. And it was like a super workers movement. There was like a cult of the tractor. There was a lot of really kind of glamorous, somewhat sexy, like tractor propaganda, where you've got like, we're gonna use like big tools, we're gonna farm the land, we're gonna industrialize, we're gonna be super productive, and we've got these like glowy skinned, really strong, bright-eyed young people who can do 10 days worth of work in 2 hours. So the Stakhanovites were like the super workers, and there was like a cult of the super worker and a celebration of the super worker, and all of the, like, if you Google this and like get the images up on the posters, it will give you a good sense about this. Okay, so there's a romance of the tractor, there's a Stakhanovite movement, and then in 1929, you get really like the kind of official end of NEP, and you get forced collectivization. And collectivization is when the peasants no longer get to keep their land. And remember, the vast majority of what had been the Russian Empire and is now the Soviet Union is peasants. We have not yet transitioned into an industrial capitalist economy. So you have all these peasants on farms. Now you're going to try to collectivize the farms. So you're going to take away all the private property from the peasants. Not that the peasants had a lot of private property, but say they have a cow, a chicken, they have their own farm tools, they have their own plot of land. You're going to take all that away, and you're going to put them on collective farms, the kolkhoz. And lo and behold, it turns out that peasants aren't really happy about this. They really don't want to give up their cow, their plot of land, their chickens, especially but not exclusively in Ukraine, and in places where there's particularly strong traditions of individual peasant farming. And collectivization is going to be done brutally. It's also going to be done together with a process that will be called dekulakization. And in fact, the greatest expert on dekulakization is Lynn Viola, who is recently retired from here. Is a great Soviet historian, but is still around in Toronto. So if you really want to think about dekulakization, you should both read Lynn's books, and try to track Lynn down. I'm going to try to get her to come back and do some public events, both with the students and the public, because she is one of the great Soviet historians. Also very modest. But what a kulak was, a kulak was allegedly a rich peasant, and so they try to create this kind of imaginary bourgeois exploiter worker analogy in the countryside. And so you need to find some class of people to play the role of the bourgeois exploiters in Marxism. That's going to be the kulaks. That's going to be the wealthy peasants. Now, from our point of view, the wealthy peasant in these villages, this is a very impoverished place, is like the peasant who has 2 cows instead of 1 cow. I mean, these aren't really wealthy peasants. These are peasants who are slightly above starvation. They are relatively the people who are slightly better off in the village. and they're going to get deported, and sent to labor camps. You're going to like skim those guys off, which of course is going to be perverse in various ways. It's going to be cruel, it's going to be unjust, and it's also going to decapitate the villages of their most productive farmers. So for all these reasons, it's not going to bode well. And you're going to put people on these collective farms that they don't want to go to. This is going to lead, by 1931 into 1932, 1933, to massive famine on the collective farms. Now, there remains a debate to this day how much of the famines, which are going to kill some 4 million people who will starve to death. The center of them is going to be in present-day Ukraine, but also in Western Russia and Kazakhstan. How much of it was intentionally engineered to get rid of the opposition, and in particular Ukrainian peasants with a kind of Ukrainian national consciousness, and how much of it was just bad luck, bad harvest, and how much of it was just a draconian policy that was, the center, the city, Moscow, was going to take the grain from the peasants.
I was just going to say, I think it's very clearly genocide, because if we look at, for example, other famine genocides like Ireland or Bangladesh, they kept exporting grain. There was a famine during the Russian Civil War where they accepted grain aid from the West, Lenin accepted grain aid, but during the Holodomor, they kept exporting grain from Ukraine, and so therefore it was a famine genocide by neglect.
So Finn's taking the very strong genocide position. I'm sympathetic to that position. The famine in Ukraine is referred to as the Holodomor, the death by hunger, and it remains, a point of very traumatic historical memory. Anne Applebaum in her book came out on the side of genocide. Norman Naimark came out on the side of genocide. Hiroaki Karamiya, came out on the side of Stalin's cruelty, not necessarily genocide. But anyway, for our purposes, it's not a very important debate. The important debate is that Stalin did not care about starving millions of peasants to death. Whether he specifically preferred to starve some and not others, he didn't care about starving millions of peasants to death. What he cared about was taking the grain from the peasants and using it to sell abroad for hard currency, to fund the industrialization that would jumpstart industrialization, that would create the factories, that would create the proletariat that they needed to have a communist country. Because you need a proletariat, you need factories. How are you going to catch up and overtake the West? You've got to industrialize, and you've got to do it much faster. You've got to leapfrog. How are you going to get this hard currency? You're going to sell the peasants grain. And so there was this, you herd the peasants, you force them onto these collective farms, you control everyone, and then you have your party guys come out and take away that grain. And if anyone tries to save some grain for themselves, you kill them. You kill them, you send them to a labor camp, you get rid of them in some way. So you carry out these extremely draconian starvation policies. And then you also don't let the peasants leave the collective farms and move to the cities. You force them to keep producing grain even when there's a bad harvest, so that they will be producing these grains that you can sell abroad. So there are internal passports. You don't let people leave the countryside. Anyone caught taking even a handful of grain can be deported or executed. This leads to cannibalism in the countryside. It leads to an estimated 5 to 7 million deaths by starvation, with as many as 4 million in Ukraine alone. So it's really not a particularly nice story. There was a recent film made by Andrea Chalupa and Agnieszka Holland, Mr. Jones, which tells you somewhat of the story of the Holodomor and the famine in Ukraine. It's told from the point of view of a Welsh journalist who is one of very few journalists who manages to get out there in the Ukrainian countryside and see what's happening, because the Stalinist regime tries to cover it up. Okay, there's also Vasily Grossman's book for Everything Flows, which is much shorter than Life and Fate, has a very good section of it. He was a Soviet writer that also goes through the famine. So I mean, there's only so much one can read about the famine without it kind of like destroying your soul. But if you want to kind of commune, I can recommend those things. I think I put them on your handout. Okay, let me get into Stalinist terror. Like, let me get into a different kind of Stalinist terror. Let me get into the purges. So Stalinism is about, it's about forced collectivization of agriculture. It's about the abolition of private property. It's about draconian industrialization at all cost. It's about the party's monopoly on power. It's about the Stakhanovite movement and the cult of labor. It's about socialist realism. There's going to be a new aesthetic policy. So the avant-garde is now going to be condemned. All of these like very exciting writers and poets like Mayakovsky, who would kill himself before they officially institute socialist realism. But now everyone in art and literature is supposed to create the same style. It's called socialist realism, which is realist-informed socialist in content. If you want to like look at socialist realist literature, you can also, or paintings in particular, you can pull them up on Google very easily. There are lots of smiling people on tractors. The idea with socialist realism is realist inform doesn't mean how things actually look today, but by the time your painting's ready next week, everything's going to be great. So like, think about the future, because like it's all about the future. It's all about the future. Like, paint that omelet. There's no reason, like, by the time your book is done, the omelet will be ready. Like, that's the idea. But it's also, so it's about all those things. But it's also in some sense fundamentally, and I think at its essence, about a kind of terror and panopticon state. And so I want to kind of take you now into the Stalinist purges. And I always talk too long, but I want to spend a little bit of time talking about them in the Soviet Union, and then I want to move over to post-war Czechoslovakia and tell you a kind of analogous but different story, so you get two different settings. So Stalin has various theories going forward. One of them is socialism in one country. We're no longer going to wait for the workers of the world to unite. Another one of them is the so-called intensification of the class struggle. And what intensification of the class struggle means is, like, into the 1930s, people are being promoted, they're upwardly mobile, you're carrying out more and more terror against, people you consider class enemies, and that's creating space for people to be upwardly mobile. But you're also, he's promising that basically we're just around the corner from communism, our victory is assured. But paradoxically, goes the theory, just as the communist victory is assured, the class enemy gets all the more sneaky, clever, insidious, and tries to infiltrate and penetrate because they get more and more desperate. So suddenly you have to be very, very vigilant. Vigilance is a big Stalinist word, because the class enemy is going to sneak in. They're going to sneak in, in a particularly clever way because they know they've really lost. So there's a kind of, Derridian aporia here. They could be anywhere. They could be at your workplace. They could be in your friend circle. They could be in your own family. They could be in your own bed. The class enemy is infinitely sneaky. You have to watch out for them. They could be anywhere. This is the theory of the intensification of the class struggle. The enemy conceals himself and could be in your own ranks. And this is where things get psychologically much more complicated than anything you had in Nazism, which is part of, I mean, Tony and I kind of shared this fascination with the purges and the psychology of the purges. Because when you have Nazism, and Tim will tell you plenty about Nazism, it's very clear where the line is between us and them. Right, you're either an Aryan or you're a non-Aryan. You're either like a German or a Jew. It's not ambiguous. But it's very different under Stalinism because this sense of the enemy sneaking in, the enemy that could be within your own ranks, within your own party, within your own marriage. Okay, so there's a contradiction here because Stalin is both promising that the victory of communism is now assured, and we're just seconds away from paradise. Like, go ahead, paint that omelet. By the time your painting's hung next week, it'll be ready. Yeah. But at the same time, you need to be intensely vigilant at every given moment. And the vigilance suggests contingency, right? The vigilance suggests that if you're not really, really careful, the enemy will defeat you. The enemy will sneak in and defeat you. So there's a fundamental contradiction in there. There's a lot of talk about enemies of the people. Who are enemies of the people. And it could be that the people who are the greatest Bolsheviks actually turn out to be enemies of the people. There are people going to be charged with wrecking and sabotage, with being Trotskyite spies, with being Western capitalist imperialist, with plotting counter-revolution. Now, part of what's going on is that, people are not living well. People are starving. People are barely getting by. How do you explain that utopia has not yet arrived? Well, because there are enemies. There are enemies who are sabotaging your efforts. There are enemies who are wrecking things. There are enemies who are stealing things. We've got to turn all our attention to the enemy. So there's a real scapegoating function to the purges. And what's going to happen is a kind of, as we move into the 30s, is just when you have the most dramatic social mobility. Together with that, you have the most dramatic purging. People are going to start to just disappear, getting arrested, one by one by one. Generally in the middle of the night. The secret police comes to the door at the end, in the middle of the night, and they knock on the door and they take people away. And there's a kind of spiral effect to it. There's more and more people get arrested, and it's contagious, right? Because once you're arrested, anyone you had any contact with is then under suspicion, and then anyone those people had contact with. And so to be in Moscow in 1937 was, you have these stories of people just waiting to be arrested, and at a certain point wanting to be arrested because they can't deal with the anxiety of waiting to be arrested, of seeing one person after another. One of the best accounts of this is by Nadezhda Mandelstam, the writer and the wife of the poet also Mandelstam, who's going to be purged. And she talks about going back to Moscow. They were in Kiev after the Civil War. And she says, when I returned to Moscow after the war, I found that everybody covered their telephones with cushions because it was rumored that they were equipped with recording devices. And the most ordinary householders trembled with terror in the presence of the black metal object listening in on their innermost thoughts. Nobody trusted anyone else. And every acquaintance was a suspected police informer. It sometimes seemed as though the whole country was suffering from persecution mania, and we still haven't recovered from it. We all felt as if we were constantly exposed to X-rays, and the principal means of control over us was mutual surveillance. So this way in which everyone becomes both infinitely powerful and infinitely vulnerable. Because anyone can denounce anyone else at any given moment. You would like your neighbor's apartment? Well, all you have to do is mention that that person rolled their eyes when somebody said Stalin's name. And that's enough. That person will be taken away. But you're also infinitely vulnerable because anyone can denounce you. And so this atomization of society, and the terror that it creates. And Nadezhda Mandelstam writes, she said, nothing binds people together more than complicity in the same crime. The more people could be implicated in compromise, the more traitors, informants, and police spies there were, the greater would be the number of people supporting the regime and longing for it to last thousands of years. And when it is common knowledge that everyone is summoned like this, people lose their social instincts. The ties between them weaken. Everybody retires to his corner and keeps his mouth shut. People, she said, developed two kinds of phobias. Some suspected that everybody they met was an informer, others that they might be taken for one. So this spiral of terror, that turns into, a kind of mania, and a kind of insanity. And then you have not only like the bourgeois experts, or the wealthy peasants, and those people are being purged. And, at a certain point, a lot of the literature was like, well, there were people benefiting from this because you get rid of the elite first, and then you have upward mobility. But then it's also the party will turn against itself. And so one by one, Stalin will go after the old Bolsheviks who were leaders of the revolution. And those people will not just get taken away in the middle of the night and shot in prison cells. Those people are going to be put on trial. And they're going to be put on show trial. So they're going to be put on trial in a way that it will be a performance, a didactic performance for the whole country. And I want to tell you a little bit about this, because I think in some ways it's understanding the trials, and the hold they had on people that kind of takes you into the center of Stalinism. They come from, to a certain extent, a Marxist genre of self-criticism. And self-criticism, samokritika, was a thing. And it was a very specific thing. There was a language you used. Part of it was used when you tried to apply for the party, you gave a party autobiography. If you were accused of something, you articulated a self-criticism. And a self-criticism was you were generally articulating a criticism of how your own subjective, personal self failed to completely, transparently align with the objective laws of history and the direction of the party. So the idea was you purge everything in yourself that was not completely, transparently part of this, historically predestined, Bolshevik path to utopia. And it was a fascinating psychological exercise because people did it very seriously. And the language that they're going to use at the trial, the language of these elaborate confessions, comes from this language of samokritika, self-criticism. The famous novel about this is Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon, which is based largely on the Bukharin trial in Moscow from the mid-1930s. And that the character, the old Bolsheviks who was going to be put on trial, is named Rubashov. And Rubashov says in his diary, "We resembled the great inquisitors in that we persecuted the seeds of evil not only in men's deeds, but in their thoughts. We admitted no private sphere, not even inside a man's skull." So you could be persecuted for having thoughts against the party, like for rolling your eyes when they said Stalin's name. You didn't have to do anything. It was enough that you had subjective feelings against the iron laws of history. And there was, for intellectuals, this often had a kind of almost masochistic appeal. This desire to lose oneself in this great, grandiose project that was so much greater than any individual. If you've read that science fiction-y dystopian novel by Yevgeny Zamyatin, which was the model for Orwell's 1984, there's a line where he says, the idea of we comes from God. I comes from the devil. It's all about dissolving the I in favor of merging with the whole. And that was an incredibly seductive idea, like the idea of what does it mean to dissolve the I and merge with the whole. Okay, let me read you a couple quotations from hardcore, high-ranking Bolsheviks who were purged in the 1930s. This one is Jan Hempel, who was a Polish communist who goes to the Soviet Union. This is my translation. He's writing to his sister in August 1934. And she's back in Poland, and he's in the Soviet Union. And she says, you who are there in the old world cannot even conceive of the fullness of the life we live here in absolutely every realm. I recall the arguments of various bourgeois smart Alecs who contended that under socialism, stagnancy and routine would reign. In reality, a whole new world is unfolding before us. A world of joyous because necessarily victorious, even while difficult battle. A world built anew with our hands, with millions of hands and minds directed by a common will, consciousness deliberately cultivating a new life. For the first time in human history, man has begun to consciously create his own history. People coming here from capitalist countries often see only the external accomplishments, the enormous factories, the new agricultures, new cities arising in the wilderness. Yet how seldom do they see the birth of the new man who is creating it all. This new man grows here with every step. New, young, he looks daringly into the future, perfectly aware of his own strengths and aspirations, deeply and powerfully conscious of the fact that he is building the whole of the new world with his own hands. And Hempel is a historical figure. I read about him in my first book, who I felt like I knew fairly well. He is absolutely sincere. He is absolutely sincere. He is 100% in. He is extraordinarily well-read and well-educated, and he's going to be one of the people killed in the Stalinist purges. These real believers. Another one was a friend of Hempel's, a Polish futurist poet Bruno Jastrzębski, who emigrates to the Soviet Union to take part in this great project of building communism. And he is also going to get arrested from the purges, and will be tortured into giving an elaborate self-flagellating confession of Polish nationalism and activism on behalf of a Polish espionage organization that is anti-Soviet. And he writes, before his execution, he says, under torture, I confessed to things that weren't true, but if this is what the party needs, it's okay. And then he composes in January 1938 from his prison cell his last text, an autobiographical testimony, and he says, it was only the NKVD, the secret police, it was only the NKVD authorities who opened my eyes and helped me to understand my guilt, to perceive the full depth of the muck in which I was wading about like a blind man. I am grateful to the NKVD authorities for the fact that thanks to the methods applied to me, they helped me to regain my sight and are helping to wash away all of the filth that has clung to me since I came into contact with the criminal gang of spies and villains. So the way in which it kind of worked on people's psyche, that they were willing to do anything, including sacrifice themselves, including believing the worst things about their closest friends, in order to assure this utopian project for all of mankind. I want to read you something from Bukharin's trial. You have to really kind of feel the language of the trials. There's a film by Sergei Loznitsa called The Trial, based on one of these show trials in the 1930s that you could stream on the internet. There's an English subtitled version. But Bukharin, who was one of the most important old Bolsheviks, who was an economist, he's going to get arrested. He will be the infamous Inquisitor Vyshinsky presides over this trial. And here is what Bukharin says in court. He says, and these are fantastical confessions. He says, I want to say that I was not one of the cogs of counter-revolution, but one of the leaders of the counter-revolution. And as one of the leaders, I answer in far greater degree, bear far greater responsibility than any of the cogs. And so I cannot be suspected of wanting to wriggle out of or repudiate responsibility, even if I were not a member of the Trotskyite organization. We embarked on treachery, crime, and treason. But for the sake of what did we embark on this? We turned into an insurrectionary band. We organized terrorist groups engaged in wrecking activities, wanting to overthrow the valiant leadership of Stalin, the Soviet government of the proletariat. Now, all of this is false. All of this elaborate self-flagellating confessions, and people know they're going to their deaths. Bukharin's last statement, he says he rejects any defense, anyone who attempts to defend him. He says, because I am kneeling before the country, before the party, before the whole people. The monstrousness of my crimes is immeasurable, especially in the new stage of the struggle of the Soviet Union. May this trial be the last severe lesson, and may the great might of the Soviet Union become clear to all. Let it be clear to all that the counter-revolutionary thesis of the national limitedness of the Soviet Union has remained suspended in the air like a wretched rag. Everyone perceives the wise leadership of the country that is ensured by Stalin. And then Vyshinsky responds. He says, time will pass. Time will pass. The graves of the odious traitors will be overgrown with weeds, covered with the eternal contempt of Soviet people, of the whole Soviet nation. But over us, over our happy country, our sun will shine with its bright rays as clearly and joyfully as before. We, our nation, will walk as we did before on a road cleansed of the last impurity and vileness of the past, following our beloved leader and teacher, the great Stalin, forward and ever forward to communism. And these guys were believers. They were real believers. Rubashov in Darkness at Noon says to one of the party comrades, he says, the party can never be mistaken. You and I can make a mistake, not the party. The party, comrade, is more than you and I and 1,000 others like you and I. The party is the embodiment of the revolutionary idea in history. History knows no scruples and no hesitation. Inert and unerring, she flows toward her goal. At every bend in her course, she leaves the mud which she carries and the corpses of the drowned. History knows her way, she makes no mistakes. He who has not absolute faith in history does not belong in the party's ranks. So this absolute certainty, and the seduction of absolute certainty, that history is moving in this direction. It is moving towards this utopia. As Hegel said, history is the slaughter bench. There are going to have to be sacrifices. But what are those sacrifices when you are moving towards utopia? The individual was nothing, Rubashov says. The party was all. The party was everything. To fulfill oneself was to purge everything from oneself, to strip everything oneself that was not in perfect alignment. Rubashov says in Kessler's novel, in his concluding statement, "Woe unto the defeated whom history treads into the dust. With that, my task is ended. I have paid. My account with history is settled. To ask you for mercy would be derision. I have nothing more to say." And he's playing off Bukharin's confession here. Now, there's a whole literature on why the old Bolsheviks confessed. Did they confess because they were tortured? Did they confess as a last service to the party? If this is what the party needs from me, to sacrifice myself, to be the scapegoat, then I am willing to do it because whatever the party needs from me is de facto justified? Or was it, if the revolution has gone wrong, if we have given our lives for something that turned to terror, how do you ever live with yourself? Okay, I want to take the next 20 minutes and take you to another case, take you to post-war Czechoslovakia, to give you a sense of what happens with all this as we move through time. So I'm leaving you in the 1930s. 1930s in Czechoslovakia, like everywhere in Europe, is a time of a polarizing political spectrum. Left is becoming more radical, right's becoming more radical, center is disappearing. Czechoslovakia, though, is the only one of the post-World War I interwar successor states that actually does maintain some kind of liberal center to the very end. And they basically get screwed over for it. When the Nazis take power in Germany, Hitler decides in 1938 he wants the Sudetenland, which is this kind of western part of Czechoslovakia that's inhabited largely by ethnic Germans. There's a conference at Munich in September 1938 at which the Italian, French, and British leaders attend. No one from Czechoslovakia is invited. At this time, Edward Beneš is president. Tomáš Masaryk has just died, the founding president of Czechoslovakia. And Neville Chamberlain, as Prime Minister of Great Britain, and as somebody who thinks he has learned the lessons of the First World War, when everyone is just a little too excited to jump into the war, he agrees to give this part of Czechoslovakia to Hitler. And Hitler says, if you just give this to me, then I'll be nice and won't go to war in Europe. Chamberlain comes back to London at the end of September 1938 and says famously, now infamously, I bring you peace in our time, and how horrible and fantastic it is if we were building trenches and trying on gas masks on behalf of a quarrel in a faraway country between people about whom we know nothing. Czechoslovakia decides not to fight. The Nazi Germany annexes the Sudetenland, then in March they occupy Bohemia and Moravia and turn Slovakia into a Catholic fascist state under Nazi tutelage. For our purposes, the important part of this story is that in English, September 1938 is always known as the appeasement at Munich. In Czechoslovakia, the phrase is zrada, the betrayal at Munich. Western liberal bourgeois democracy sells out Czechoslovakia at Munich. And they are not going to forget that. They're not going to forget that. They're not going to forget their experience of German occupation. And they're not going to forget the fact that it's going to be the Red Army that will liberate Prague after Western bourgeois democracy has sold out Czechoslovakia at Munich. So Prague is liberated by the Red Army. American forces, by agreement, stop in Pilsen. There's a brief period between 1945 and 1948 in Czechoslovakia where Beneš returns from exile, and there is a kind of coalition government struggling. The left has increased tremendously in strength through the war, largely because of the precedent of Munich. The Western democracy sells out Czechoslovakia, the Red Army liberates Prague. There's a sense of people suffered tremendously during the war. They want some kind of distribution. In 1946, there are genuinely free and fair elections in Czechoslovakia in which the communists win legitimately 38% of the vote. So not a majority, but a plurality, more than any other single party. There is then a revolution, in some sense a coup. I won't get into the details. That's not what I want to focus on, in February 1948. And then a communist regime comes to power in Czechoslovakia, which is then really a Stalinist regime. And Stalinism has been going on now in the Soviet Union since 1928, 1929, and now jump forward 20 years. Now, starting in February 1948, we're going to have Stalinism in Czechoslovakia. And I want to read you a Milan Kundera quote where he describes this happening. And he is a young person who is very enthusiastic. He says, "And so it happened that in February 1948, the communists took power not in bloodshed and violence, but to the cheers of about half the population. And please note," he said, "the half that cheered was the more dynamic, the more intelligent, the better half." There was tremendous popular enthusiasm. Now let me see. Maybe I have time to tell you about one big show trial. I will leave out the other show trial. There was the first big show trial was of a woman named Milada Horakova and her co-conspirators, who is an extraordinary figure, a Democrat, a feminist, somebody who was close to Masaryk, someone who had been in Gestapo prison during the Second World War and was tortured there, a 50-year-old mother of a 16-year-old child. She was not a communist. And she's going to be executed together with her co-conspirators in what was, in some ways, particularly chilling because they were putting a middle-aged woman and a mother on trial. And they torture a false confession out of her. Although they don't completely break her. And if you scrutinize the transcripts, which I have, you can see the moments where she goes off script. And Kundera writes about the enthusiasm of the public cheering on this execution when Milada Horakova is hanged. And he says, "And knowing full well that the day before in their fair city, one woman and one surrealist had been hanged by the neck, the young Czechs went on dancing and dancing. And they danced all the more frantically because the dance was the manifestation of their innocence, the purity that shone forth against the black villainy of two public enemies who betrayed the people and its hopes." Okay, but let me take my last 15 minutes or so and tell you about the Slansky trial, which is the trial of the party leadership turned against itself. So Rudolf Slansky had been the general secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia since 1945. There had just been a big 50th birthday party celebration for him. He's arrested in the summer of 1951, together with 13 co-defendants. One of those 13 co-defendants was somebody named Rudolf Margolis, another Rudolf. And I want to tell you a little bit about him because this is an interesting story. In fact, I'm going to start by telling you about his wife, who is Tim making you read Hedda Margolis-Kowali's book? Okay, the reference comes up in that chapter on Thinking the 20th Century. I think Tony says everyone should read this book. Everyone should read this book. Hedda Margolis-Kowali was one of the great women of the 20th century, who is now largely forgotten but should not be. She was a Czech Jew. She was, I think she was around 19 in 1939. I think she was born around 1919, 1920. Assimilated Czech Jew. Who is taken, with her parents, I think first to Terezín and then to Auschwitz, and eventually escapes from a death march late in the war and makes her way back to Prague. She makes her way back to Prague, half starved, half dead. None of her old friends will take her in. Not because they don't care, and not because they're Nazis, and not because they're anti-Semites, but because they're afraid. Because to harbor a Jew, to be hiding a Jew in your home, threatens the death penalty for the whole family if anybody gets caught. And it's a very interesting kind of moral dilemma. When I later met her before she died, she said, "But what right did I have to ask them to risk their lives for me?" She said, "I had a right to try to save my own life, but I didn't have a right to ask other people, to give up theirs." So she survives this war, the only one in her family, and her pre-war fiance also survives, and they find each other when he comes back to Prague, and this is Rudolf Margolis. And then together, as this, almost fairy tale-ish happy ending, although everyone else in their families is dead. They get married. They join the Communist Party together. They have a son. And for Rudolph, who is very gung-ho, but also for Hedda, it was the experience of being in the camps that leads them to the Communist Party. And this is really important to understand. This is why I want to tell the post-war part of the story. One of the things that Hedda would say, that Arnoš Lustig would say, that Holocaust survivors would say, is that in the Nazi camps, the communists were the very best people. They were the only ones who had a kind of structure of solidarity, who had a vision of the world to come when fascism was defeated that was absolutely certain. Who had a kind of code of behavior developed, from a history of being underground, from people sitting in prison. They were the only one who was prepared. They had their own ethics. They held up better in the Nazi camps than anyone else did. Like everyone who came out of Auschwitz and survives remembers the communist with respect. And it's an important part of the story, because it was a time when the world was only divided into, there were the Nazis and the Stalinists. There were only two options. That was where you were. And so they come back and they join the Communist Party, as real believers. And then Rudolph is arrested. He rises very quickly to be a prominent person in the party, and he's one of these 14 defendants put on trial in the Slansky trial. 11 of them were Jews. There's also a kind of anti-Semitic element to this story. And they were all tried as, quote, Trotskyite, Titoist, Zionist, bourgeois national traitors and enemies of the Czechoslovak people, of the People's Democratic Order and Socialism, who, in the service of American imperialists and steered by hostile Western intelligence services, created a treasonous conspiratorial nucleus, undermined the People's Democratic Order, obstructed the building of socialism, harmed the national economy, conducted espionage operations, and weakened the unity of the Czechoslovak people and the defensive capability of the Republic in order to alienate the Republic from its unyielding alliance and friendship with the Soviet Union, to liquidate the People's Democratic rule in Czechoslovakia, to restore capitalism, to bootstrap our Republic once again to the imperialist camp, and to destroy its independence and freedom. The language is absolutely fantastical. And if you think about, you're tried as a Trotskyite, a Titoist, a Zionist, a bourgeois nationalist. These are mutually contradictory accusations. They're absolutely fantastical. And they torture these people into giving these ritualistic, extremely ostentatious confessions. And so people like Slansky answer, they ask, in your infinite hatred for the beautiful, peace-loving people of Czechoslovakia, were there still other ways in which you tried to sabotage the glorious socialist future? And they would answer, yes, in my infinite hatred for and so the fantastical language is part of the phenomenon, and part of the way in which these trials functioned as theater. The trial was broadcast live. The newspapers printed the transcripts every day. I read through the microfilm versions of these daily newspapers at one point. Every day, splattered across the front page. Death to the fascists, death to the imperialists, death to the traitors. The workers demand death. You've got this orgy of bloodlust. The families and the wives, although not Hedda Cavalli, but many of the families and the wives of the accused also come out against the defendants, demanding the highest punishment, believing that the party could not be wrong. So this man who was with me in the French anti-Nazi resistance, who is the father of my 3 children, who has been my husband for years, but the party says he was a traitor. And how could the party be wrong? The party was never wrong. Andre Simon, whose real name was Otto Katz, who was one of the defendants of that trial, gets up there and gives a closing statement at the trial that is taken almost verbatim from Rubashev's Confession at Darkness at Noon. And Kessler takes it almost verbatim from Bukharin. It is too fantastical to be believed in Moscow in the 1930s. You know, Kessler exposes it in the meantime. André Simon spits it back out in Prague in 1952, and they buy it, and they hang him. With a sincere conviction. And that has to be grasped. Like that kind of hysteria has to be grasped. When do I have time to tell this story? Okay, maybe let me tell you a couple, just like maybe one thing about Hedda Kovaly, who was remarkable. In 1997, when I was a graduate student, I was a guest co-editor for a Czech feminist journal, who sent me to interview her. And she ends up, she survives the account of her last meeting with her husband right before her execution is extraordinary. You should all read this book. She ends up escaping from Czechoslovakia after 1968. She spends 20 years at Harvard, and then moves back to Prague after the fall of communism. And I was in Warsaw at the time, doing research for my dissertation, and I took the overnight train to Prague to interview her. And her English is much better than my Czech, but we were publishing the interview in Czech, so I needed to do it in Czech. And my Czech in general at that time was much better than my Polish, but the Polish was somehow more in the front of my head because I was living in Warsaw at the time, even though I'd only been there for like a month. And I was nervous and I was starstruck and I was in awe of this woman. And I took the overnight train, so I hadn't really slept, and I get to her apartment, and she's just lovely. And I start, I have a tape recorder, and I start talking, and I immediately start mixing up the Czech and the Polish, and every word is every sentence is coming out all and Czech and Polish are a bit like Spanish and Italian. I mean, they're, and she said, "Oh, don't worry, it's no problem at all." She said, "When I was in Auschwitz, I used to talk to the Polish girls in Czech. And they spoke to me in Polish, and we always understood one another." And there was something about the way she said, "When I was in Auschwitz, I used to talk to the Polish girls," that I almost with nostalgia, like her friends from junior high school, there was a warmth in how she remembered them. I mean, she was absolutely extraordinary. And the editor of this journal had said, "When you get there, you have to ask her." She and her husband were members of the communist elite. What was the Slomsky trial that her husband was condemned and executed in was not the first trial. She must have been watching the trial of Milada Horakova. What was she thinking then? Why did they not come out in defense of her then? She said, "You have to ask her." And I got there, and I talking to this woman who had just been to hell twice, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. I couldn't ask her. Okay, let me just leave you with two, quick things. One, a quote from Robert Conquest, the Cold War historian, who said, "Yes, Stalinism is one way of achieving industrialization, just like cannibalism is one way of achieving a high-protein diet." The way in which, one of the things that happened then after Stalin's death and Khrushchev's secret speech is that victims of these trials start being rehabilitated, often posthumously. And one of the things the Communist Party would do is they would posthumously return one's party card to the next of kin. So you restore someone's good standing as a communist with their party card to the survivors of the family. And that was extraordinarily meaningful because it meant everything to be part of this project that was going to save the world. When the Stalinist archives started to open in the 1990s, when I was becoming a historian, one of the senior historians said, "The big secret we find out when the Stalinist archives are opening now about the communists, they were really communist. They were really believers. It's not true later, but it's true in the Stalinist period." And let me just leave you with one Slavoj Žižek quote where he's comparing Nazism and Stalinism. This is from The Plague of Fantasies. And he says, the fundamental difference between the respective natures of Stalinist and fascist totalitarianism can be discerned through a tiny but significant detail. After the fascist leader finishes his public speech and the crowd applause, the leader acknowledges himself as the addressee of the applause. He bows to the public, or he stares at a distant point, or something similar. Whereas the Stalinist leader stands up himself and starts to applaud. This, Zizek says, signifies a fundamentally different discursive position. The Stalinist leader is also compelled to applaud, since the true addressee of the people's applause is not himself, but that big other of history, whose humble servant he is. Okay, thank you. I will leave you with that.